Salve omnes, and welcome back. In this video, we will be covering Caesar Book 5, chapters 26 and 27, following the AP Latin curriculum. As always, just a quick reminder of the color coding we have on the screen. Words in red indicate the subjects, words in green are our verbs, and any word in blue is our direct object. Beyond that, words that are in boldface are the main clause, and words that are not are in some way subordinate to the main thoughts. So, going one sentence at a time, here we go. When last we left off, we had just heard in chapter 25 about the death of a Gaul, Tesgetius, among the Carnutes, and how Caesar reacted to that, fearing perhaps that with this attack on Tesgetius, perhaps the tribe might collapse or go into some sort of open revolt. And here we are, chapter 26, Diebus circiter quindecim. So this is an ablative of time when, after about 15 days, quibus in hiberna ventunst. Now this ventum est over here, this ventum est is an impersonal construction. All right, so literally, there was a coming, but we understand, there's a dative of agent missing, illis or nostris, perhaps. And so after about 15 days, or on about the 15th day, since we came, or our men came, into their winter camp, initium repentini tumultus ac defectionis, the beginning of a sudden uprising and rebellion. All right, so tumultus being a fourth declension word, these are all genitives, repentini to defectionis. Ortum est, arose. All right, this is a deponent verb, orior, that's why even though it looks passive, we understand it as active. And that's important because when we get to ab ambiorige et catavulco, those are not ablatives of agent. Okay, those are ablatives of source. The beginning of a sudden uprising and revolt arose from Ambiorix and Catavulcus, not by. Who, let's scroll down a bit to learn about Ambiorix and Catavulcus, who, and then we go straight into a cum. And this cum, even though there isn't anything signaling it, is actually concessive because of the context of what's going on. Ambiorix and Catavulcus have started an uprising despite the fact, right, although ad fines regni sui, Sabino cotaeque praesto fuissent. They had been fuissent, and praesto goes with fuissent to create an expression in Latin, to be at hand, or to be present. They had been present for, that takes us to the datives, Sabino cotaeque, for Sabinus and Cotta, the legates of this legion and a half, ad fines regni sui, at the borders of their kingdom. So they had met, Ambiorix and Catavulcus had met the Romans as they were marching into their winter camps, and, we find out, frumentum in hiberna comporto vicent. They had brought grain to their winter camps. This presumably would have been a tax or something that the Romans would have exacted from the locals in the form of food to get them through the winter. So even though Ambiorix and Catavulcus had done what they were supposed to do for the Romans, let's go down and see what actually happened. Impulsi. They had been stirred up or driven by, reading backwards here, nuntiis, by messages from, even though it's genitive, indutio maris of the Treveri. So both these words are genitive, but indutio maris is the man's name, Treveri is his tribe. Okay, and if we remember, one of Caesar's legions, the one under the command of Titus Labienus, is camped near the region of the Treveri. So we learned that they too have a role to play in this uprising. So having been driven by messages from indutio maris of the Treveri, what did Ambiorix and Catavulcus do? Suos concitaverunt, they stirred up their men, they roused them. And, now this que is technically linking concitaverunt with venerunt, down here, venerunt. But the subito that it's connected to goes with the ablative absolute, oppressis lignatoribus. All right? So, they stirred up their men, they roused them, and having suddenly overwhelmed the wood gatherers, or literally with the wood gatherers suddenly overwhelmed or attacked. All right. With a great band, to the camps to attack, they came. All right, Ambiorix and Catavolcus with their people. Quick note about opugnatum right here. This is a supine from the fourth principal part of the verb, opugnare. It is a supine, and we perhaps remember that supines, when used with verbs of motion, like venio, can function as purpose expressions. Okay, so when we read opugnatum venerunt, we're reading they came for the purpose of attacking. All right, so that's why we say they came to the camp to attack it, as if this were an infinitive, but it isn't. It is a supine, and we see that a lot with supines. Mirabile dictu, wonderful to say. Miserabile visu, wonderful to, or horrible to see. Venerunt opugnatum, they came to attack. So it is a supine expressing purpose. All right, let's see how well this attack went. We start off with a cum clause in the next sentence. Because, probably because, could be when, but probably because, given that, as we can see down here, the enemy don't actually win. Because quickly our men had seized their arms and climbed the rampart. We're going to get used to this expression here in Book 5. There's going to be a great deal of climbing the rampart. The rampart is the defensive fortification, the wall. And now here we have a quick ablative absolute, which technically is these three words here at the end, Hispanis equidibus emisis, but una ex parte goes with them. All right. After the Spanish cavalry were sent forth from one, in this case, gate. Right, we remember a Roman camp is basically a square. It has 4 gates, one at each point of the compass. All right, so the enemies attacked. The cavalry were sent forth from a different gate, obviously, right, so that they could swoop around. And sure enough, equestri proilio, this is an ablative of place where, in an equestrian battle, so in a cavalry fight, they were superior. So they won. All right, they, of course, being the Romans, the cavalry, the Spanish cavalry. Then we're out of the cum clause with this ablative absolute, desperata re, with the situation, that would be their attack, desperata, having been despaired of. So in English, we would probably say the enemy gave up hope that they would win. But in Latin, right, they use the passive voice. The attack was, lost hope. The attack was despaired of. Hostes suos ab oppugnatione reduxerunt. So the enemy called back their men from the battle. All right, so the enemy retreated. So the Romans have won, huzzah! But maybe not, because it turns out the enemy aren't done. Tum, then, suo more, according to their custom, an ablative of manner, conclamaverunt, the enemy, still understood because they were the subject of the previous sentence. The enemy shouted. Okay, they shouted ut, right? Uti is sometimes an alternate spelling of ut. So since there's shouting going on, and we see ut with a subjunctive down here, prodiret, we know that this is an indirect command. Okay, because there's shouting going on, there's speaking. So they shouted that someone, aliqui, just an alternate spelling of aliquis, it's not actually plural, that someone ex nostris from our men ad colloquium prodiret should come to a meeting, literally a colloquium, a discussion. All right, so they wanted to talk. Let's scroll down here so we can see the rest. Then we go into indirect speech right here. We can see that from the accusative and the infinitive. Now, most likely because they were shouting, so this is what they shouted, this is what they were saying. And the ut clause is just the purpose of why they were saying it, right? That someone should come to a meeting. Because they were saying that, they, say, the enemy, had quae. Now, this quae clause right here is technically, the whole clause has as its antecedent the implied object of habere, like an ea. They had things which. The quae is the object in its own clause. It's the object of dicere. but the entire quae clause is the object of habere. Okay, so the enemy had things which, concerning the common situation, that is to say, the fact that both sides find themselves in a fight, they wanted to say. Quibus rebus. So here the antecedent of quibus is kind of implied by the rebus. By means of these things, but it's still referring to this clause, the things they wanted to say. All right? By means of these things, and then we see this right here. This is actually indirect speech triggered off of sperarent. They hoped that, right? And then we can do this. The controversias posse minui. So they hoped that the dispute, or plural disputes, the arguments between them, could be lessened. Posse minui, passive infinitive. In English, it might seem more natural for us to say they hoped that they could lessen the disagreements, but Latin doesn't do that. Latin uses the passive voice, which is why controversias is understood as the subject of posse. So the Gauls want to talk, and so people are sent. Now, mititur is singular, even though we see two subjects, right, in this passage. We see two names, Arpaneus and Unius. We don't need to stress too much about the singular mititur. It's just singular because the closest subject to it, Gaius Arpaneus, is singular, and then Quintus Unius is attached as well. So we can say, they were sent. It's totally fine. Ad eos is, of course, the Gauls, to the Gauls. Colloquendi causa. So this is a gerund, colloquendi, being used with the ablative causa, expressing, again, kind of a purpose expression, for the sake of speaking. And then we learn who was sent, Gaius Arpaneus. Now, who is Gaius Arpaneus? Well, we learn that he is an eques Romanus. This word eques, or equestrian, as it's frequently translated, simply refers to his status in society. So he is of the upper classes, but not senatorial. It has nothing to do with the fact that he may or may not be a cavalryman. All right, it's not speaking about his role in the army. It's speaking about his class in society, so he's upper class. Which might explain the next bit that we learn, which is that he is familiaris quinti tituri. He is a friend, basically, a good friend of Quintus Titurius Sabinus. That would be the legate, one of the commanders of this 1.5 legions. So that might explain why he is sent, because he's good friends with the commander. And this other guy, Quintus Unius, who apparently is just ex Hispania quidam. Right? Quidam means a certain fellow. He's just some guy from Spain. Okay? And why is this important? Well, because, we'll scroll down to the rest of the sentence, we learn about Unius that he is someone who, before now, Iamante, right? Before now, missu Caesaris, literally by the sending of Caesar. So we would say he was sent by Caesar, but Latin uses this expression, by the sending of Caesar, to Ambiorix to go back and forth was accustomed. So this is a man who had been sent by Caesar before and had traveled back and forth to speak with Ambiorix, quite possibly because being from Hispania, he may have already spoken the language a little bit. So Ambiorix knows this man. Apud quos, in their presence, again, this quos is hos, it's not starting a relative clause, okay, it's just referring to these guys that we were talking about. In their presence, Ambiorix, in this way, or to this effect, spoke. Locutus est, right? Deponent verb. He spoke. Now, before we get into everything that follows, we need to remember locutus est. Because everything that follows, the rest of chapter 27, is going to be conveyed in indirect speech. Accusatives as subjects of infinitives. There is no more direct speech until the very last sentence of this chapter. So we need to keep that in mind as we read everything that follows. And yes, it is a lot. So let's get into it. Ambiorix said that. Here we go. Se, that would be Ambiorix. Pro Caesaris in se beneficiis. So this is similar to what we saw in the previous bit when we were talking about Tesgetius. In return for, and then pro has beneficiis, the ablative as its object. in return for the kindnesses, Caesaris, of Caesar, in se, to him. Se is always going to be, pretty much always going to be Ambiorix when we encounter it. Plurimum ei confitere debere. Now, important point. Normally we see debere, debeo, and we start there and then go to the infinitive, understanding it as ought. Okay? This is not one of those times, because what debeo means is to be in debt to. So that is actually, we have to read confiteri first. Ambiorix confessed that, and then we go into debere, which is in indirect speech. Sese is the subject of both of these infinitives. Sese confiteri, Ambiorix confessed, that sese debere, he owed plurimum, very much, ei, to Caesar, to him. The him is Caesar. It's the only other person we're talking about. So that's how that works. And then we get into these quod clauses. The first quod clause is causal. He owed a great deal to Caesar because, by means of his aid, eius opera, okay, we see that ablative. We've seen opera now a few times. Eius is Caesar, genitive. By means of Caesar's aid, from a tax, stipendio, ablative of separation here, liberatus esset. He, Ambiorix, had been freed. So Ambiorix had been freed from having to pay a tax by Caesar's kindness. Quod. This quod is relative. We see that it's indicated as the object here. It has stipendio as its antecedent, the neuter, which aduaticis finitimi suis, that's a dative, because of pendere, to pay, which he had been accustomed to pay to the aduatici, his neighbors. So, Ambiorix and presumably his tribe, the Eburones, had to pay taxes to the aduatici, their neighbors, who apparently were stronger, and Caesar freed them of that. Quod quae. This quod is linked with the first quod. All right, this quod here is being linked with this quote. It's another causal clause. It's another reason why Ambiorix is in Caesar's debt. And because, we'll hold this AE for 1 second. In fact, we need to scroll down here so we can see the whole clause. And because his son and his brother's son, okay, so his nephew, remissi essent, had been sent back. AE, there's dative. This AE is actually Ambiorix. Okay, so you see already we're starting to get a little confused with all these pronouns and all these layers of indirect speech. Okay, so Ambiorix owed Caesar a great deal because his son and nephew had been returned to him, Ambiorix, by Caesar. This is an ablative of agent with the passive remissi essent. Scrolling down, we're not done with his son and his nephew yet, because that's who quos is referring. The antecedent of quos is filius et fratris filius. They, whom the aduatuci, still this neighboring tribe, obsidum numero. This could be in the number of hostages or with the number of hostages. Okay, it's up to you. So it could be ablative of place or it could be ablative of manner. All right? It could be where they kept them. It could be how they treated them. The aduatuci, let's just jump down to the verb for simplicity's sake, had held them, all right, quos. They had been sent, okay, to them is the idea. All right, so Ambiorix had to send his son and his nephew, presumably as hostages, right, which is why obsidum numero might be in the accounting of their hostages, in the number of their hostages. They had kept them among them, apud se, that's the aduatuci here, the se is referring to the aduatuci. They had held them, the two boys, among them in their presence, in servitute et catenis. And this is just how they had held them, in slavery and chains. Kind of a hendiades, right, because servitute and catenis, right, comes together. In sort of in chained slavery. Continuing on in the same sentence, we're not done yet, but now we're moving on to something else, okay? We're not talking about the debt Ambiorix owes Caesar anymore. Now we're talking about id, this thing, Quod, it is the antecedent, which he did, fecerit. This is actually a rare perfect subjunctive, fecerit. Okay, it's obviously not future perfect indicative. We're talking about things that have already occurred. But the reason that we're seeing so many subjunctives in these subordinate clauses but not talking about them is because, generally speaking, when we go into subordinate clauses within indirect speech, which is what this whole paragraph is going to be, the verbs tend to go into the subjunctive mood instead of being in the indicative mood. It doesn't change the clause. We've seen causal clauses, to quote clauses with a subjunctive verb. Hasn't been a big deal. Now we're seeing a relative clause with a subjunctive verb. Not a big deal. All right, let's just point out, though, this is a perfect subjunctive, fecerit. The thing which he did concerning the attack on the camps, all right, so basically we're talking about the recent attack on the camp, the thing which he had done, he did not do, say from the beginning is still the subject here, still Ambiorix. Ambiorix did not do this thing which he did concerning the attack on the camps, either from his own judgment, judicio, or by his own free will, voluntate, but by the coactu civitatis. Okay, all three of these, judicio, voluntate, and coactu, are ablatives of cause. All right, so he did not do this because of his judgment, because he wanted to. He did it because of the compulsion of his tribe. So his tribe forced him to do it. Let's go down and see the rest of this. And this here is going to explain why his tribe was able to force him to attack the Romans when he didn't want to. Because remember, Ambiorix is supposed to be in charge of his tribe. His rule, sua imperia, it's plural, but we can understand it as singular. His power is, or was, of the sort that. Okay, so eius modi is setting up the ut result clause. His power is of such a sort that, and then we see this is very kind of parallel, but also a little bit confusing. So minus and quam go together. What we're going to do is we're going to hold off on understanding this non minus until we get to the quam. All right? Because the word is minus quam. It's the opposite of plus quam. And it has been split into its component pieces here. Stylistic device is called timesis. It's been split into its component pieces to help balance out the parallel structure of this sentence. So as we read, we're not going to translate the minus quam, the non-minus yet, until we get to the quam. So this is how it ends up working. His power was of such a sort that the crowd held no less of juris, of power, this is a partitive genitive, over him, that would be Ambiorix, than, you see how that works out? Non minus quam, non minus juris quam, the partitive genitive fits in there. The crowd held no less power over him than he himself, ipse, haberet, held in multitudinem, over the crowd. So Ambiorix is claiming that the power situation among the Eburones is some sort of equal balance between what the rulers want to do and what the people want to do. So he says. Okay. He continues on with this transition word, porro. Furthermore. Okay, furthermore. Hanc fuisse belle causam. This was the cause of the war, civitati, for his tribe. This is technically a dative of reference. So this is one of those situations where you could read esse with the dative as if it was habere, right? Kind of like nomen mihi est, my name is, I have this name. This was the cause of the war for the tribe. The tribe had this reason to go to war. Quod, because non potuerit, all right? Now the subject of potuerit here, another perfect subjunctive, by the way, is the understood civitas, the tribe. The tribe could not resist, could not stand against. And then we see repentinae coniurationi, the dative here, being indicated as the object. It is a dative object of resistere. Resistere will take a dative object instead of an accusative. The tribe could not stand against the sudden conspiracy of the Gauls. Ambiorix is going to be claiming that all of Gaul is in revolt, not just the Eburones. Okay, continuing on. Now Ambiorix makes a play for the Romans' sympathy by saying, id se facile ex humilitate sua probare posse. So he, again, Ambiorix, can easily demonstrate this, right, or prove this. Probare is often translated as prove, but it doesn't mean prove the way that the English word always means it. It means more demonstrate or test or something like that. So he can easily demonstrate this ex humilitate sua. Now, this word humilitate does not mean humility necessarily the way the English word does, as if Ambiorix is saying that, oh, he is so humble. This means something more like low status, near to the ground. Humus, right, is the ground. So Ambiorix is stating that his tribe has a low status. So he can easily demonstrate this from his low status because, he goes on to say, non adeo sit imperitus rerum. He is not so, that's adeo, he is not so unknowledgeable of things. The genitive rerum here depends on the adjective imperitus, which wants a genitive. Okay, unskilled of affairs. So he is not so unskilled of things, meaning that he knows, he's been around the block, he knows what's up. That, this adeo up here, triggered this result clause in ut. That, and just to make it easier, let's go down and take this verb real quick. He has faith or trusts that, right? And we see how here we've gone into indirect speech. The people of Rome could be defeated by means of his forces, right? So again, a more natural way in English might be something like, he didn't trust that they could defeat the Roman people, as if, making it the object, but Latin prefers passive verbs more than English does. That's why Populum Romanum is the subject of these infinitives, posse superari. So Ambiorix is claiming that he well understands that the Eburones have no chance against the Romans. But, here we are. Okay, moving on. He now claims that he's sharing some secret information with the Romans. This is, we can understand, kind of a hawk. This is the shared plan of Gaul, Gallii. Okay, not the Gauls, right? Just singular, Gaul. And then he goes on. Now, this phrase right here, omnibus hibernis Caesaris oppugnandis, might look like an ablative absolute, but it is not. This is actually a dative of purpose that depends on esse dictum. This day was chosen, literally was spoken, but context, right? Was chosen, dative of purpose, for the purpose of attacking all of the winter camps of Caesar. Now, yes, oppugnandis is a gerundive, so literally we understand it as for all of the camps of Caesar to be attacked, but we don't have to translate it that way with gerundives, to attack all of the camps of Caesar. Nay, negative purpose clause. There's no fearing here, so this isn't a positive fearing clause. This is a negative purpose clause. In order that not any legion, we remember perhaps that after words like nay, right? Remember the rhyme? After si, nisi, num, and nay, Ali takes a holiday. So this word qua is actually aliqua, any. So that not any legion to any other legion for help would be able to come. So a little better, so that no legion could come to another legion to help. All right? Both of these phrases, altrae legione and subsidio, are in the dative case. This is an example of something called the double dative. All right? A double dative is composed of a dative of reference, alteri legioni, and a dative of purpose, subsidio. No legion could come to another legion, right, reference, for purpose, help, to lend aid. Right, so Ambiorix is claiming that all of Gaul is in open revolt, and the point was to do it this way so that the legions could not support each other. All right, continuing on, why did this even happen? Well, Ambiorix speaking, goes on to say that not easily can Gauls say no to Gauls. Right, so he's claiming this is some sort of solidarity thing. This Gallis here, the second one, Gallis, this is dative, but it's just an indirect object triggered by negare, because negare means to say no to. That's why it expects an indirect object dative. Praesertim cum, particularly because. And yes, this cum with the subjunctive weiterator could potentially be understood as when, but, when or because, you pick. Because perhaps is slightly to be preferred. Because it seemed that, you see how we're going into indirect speech now, which is why concilium is marked as a subject and initium is marked as, initum, not initium, misspoke, initum is marked as a verb. There is an essay missing. So it seemed like this plan was entering into, or was being entered into, right? Because it's in eo, to go into. This plan had been entered into concerning the recovery of their shared freedom, right? And yes, recuperanda is another gerundive, so literally the shared freedom which was to be recovered, but we don't have to do that when we translate. All right, we are coming now closer to the end of Ambiorix's speech, and so here he talks about how quibus, with these things, this is another instance of Caesar using the relative pronoun when he really means a demonstrative pronoun like his. So by means of these things, these actions that Ambiorix has taken, right, not only going with the rebellion, but also, he claims, coming to the Romans and telling them all of this, he has, because of all of this, he has satisfecerit, another perfect subjunctive, he has done enough pro pietate, something like for the sake of his duty, right? Because remember, pietas is a tricky word to translate. It doesn't mean piety like religious devotion. It means obligation or duty. And so, since he has now done all this, now he can talk, right? Now he can focus, or he can have a business. This habere rationem is something like to pay attention to, right? So he can pay attention, he can have attention of his duty, offici, technically an objective genitive going with rationem, right? Business of his obligation or duty. So now he can pay attention to his duty pro beneficiis Caesaris, in consideration of the kind deeds of Caesar. Right, so now he has to repay Caesar. He advises, and, there's no connector, but we can understand, begs Titurius, remember this is Sabinus, the legate, for the sake of hospitality, right, because they are, if we think about the guest friend situation, right, we see that more in Epic with Virgil, but guests and hosts owe duties to each other, so Ambiorix is claiming that he's doing this because he feels that he owes a debt as a host to the Romans. That, okay, technically an indirect command because Ambiorix is advising and praying, begging, so it's an indirect command. That Titurius, right, Sabinus, consulat, that he take counsel or that he think about. Suae ac militum saluti. Suae saluti is dative, all right, technically a dative of reference, right? Sabinus should have a thought for his own health, right? Because suae is the adjective modifying saluti, and militum saluti, the health of his soldiers, all right? Militum being genitive. Okay, and then, in a classic example of burying the lead, Ambiorix drops this bomb on the Romans. A large band of Germans having been assembled, that's how we understand conductam, has crossed the Rhine. Notice the perfect infinitive here, transisse, meaning that it has already happened. Hanc, that is to say the Magna Manum, the great band, ad fore biduo, it would be here in 2 days. Ad fore, recall, fore is the common Latin abbreviation of futuram esse. Here is futuram esse, am, to match hanc, which is accusative and feminine, right? The magnam manum. So this would be ad futuram esse. The band of Germans would be here in 2 days. Okay. This phrase can sometimes be a little tricky to understand, partly because of the genitive ipsorum referring to the Romans, also because concilium, we're not going to understand concilium the way we normally do, which is like a plan, right? Capere concilium, to seize a plan, to make a plan. Rather, in this case, concilium has one of its alternate meanings, which is something like a topic for discussion, all right, or something to think about. So what Ambiorix is saying here is that this is the topic for the Romans, ipsorum, right? This is the thing that the Romans should consider. And then he goes on in an indirect question with the implied subject being the Romans, they. Okay, we see that it's an indirect question partly because of the subjunctive wellent from wolle welle, also because of the ne, right? The standard interrogative in clitic, indicating a question is being asked. So in translation, we should probably say something like whether, all right? This was the matter at hand for the Romans. Whether they wanted, and we'll come to what they want in just a second, it's down here with the infinitive, deducere. First we have this clause, priusquam finitimi sentiant, before the neighboring tribes realize anything, whether they wanted, the Romans wanted, let's take deducere to make the object easier to deal with, to lead their soldiers who have departed from the winter camp. This eduktos is not missing an essay, it's not a verb, it's just a participle describing milites. All right? So what Ambiorix is suggesting is that Sabinus and Cotta should leave with their troops, and that they should do this, they should take their troops out of winter camp and leave before anyone else nearby realizes what's going on, and they should go either to Cicero or to Labienus, of whom Quorum has as its antecedent both Cicero and Labienus. One of them, probably Cicero, right, because alter usually goes the first, the second, of whom one, about 50 miles away, the other a little further from them was. So Ambiorix is suggesting that the only thing the Romans need to consider is, do they want to go to Cicero for help, or do they want to go to Labienus for help? All right, continuing on, Ambiorix is almost finished. Illud is referring to this expression down here, so we'll come to it in a second, right? He promised this, and the this will be tutum iter per fines daturum, we'll get there. He promised this, and he confirmed it, still the it, right, by swearing an oath. Jure jurando is technically 2 words. Yes, they're in the ablative. Yes, it's effectively kind of an ablative absolute. Yes, jurando is a gerundive in form, but they've come together in Latin to basically just be a phrase that means to swear an oath, by swearing an oath. So in this case, it's just an ablative expression. He confirmed his promise with the swearing of an oath. That, all right, and because of polychary, we go into indirect speech. Se is still the subject, all right, of daturum esse. We're missing the esse in the future infinitive. So he promised them and confirmed it by swearing an oath that he would, future, give safe journey, or a safe journey, safe passage, through his borders. The other word that's missing is illis, or romanis, or something like that. Okay, coming to the end. Quod cum faciat. Same thing we've seen. Caesar uses quod. We understand hoc. When he has done this, or when he does this, because he does this, 2 things for Ambiorix. Ambiorix says that he has consulere civitati. We notice that here civitati is being taken as the dative object of consulere, When we saw it up above, consulat, it was just using datives of reference, sui saluti, but here it's being used as an object. He has considered or taken counsel for, thought about his tribe. All right, so in other words, he's doing what's right for his tribe because, that's the quote clause, they, the tribe, even though laetor is singular, right? We understand tribe in English sometimes to be kind of plural sounding. They will be lightened by, or by the winter camp. So the idea here is that the tribe will have a load taken off because the Roman winter camps will not be there anymore. Because the tribe is lightened from the burden of the winter camps. And the second reason, or the second thing that Ambiorix is saying he's accomplishing, is that now this dative Caesari is not going with consulere, it's going with consulere, it's going with gratiam referre, that he is paying thanks to Caesar, so just a straight indirect object dative, in return for his, Caesar's, good deeds, right? Or the things that he deserves. All right, so Ambiorix claims that by doing what he's done, he is both helping out his tribe, but also helping out the Romans, because he owes Caesar. And so, after all of that, we toss it off, we bring it to an end with a brief ablative absolute, hac oratione habita, with this speech having been delivered, discedit Ambiorix. Ambiorix leaves. And that is that. Ambiorix certainly has given the Romans a lot to think about, and we'll see how they do with all of this in the following chapters, and we'll see how this all plays out for the Romans. So, maximus gratias for following along with this video, and we'll see you in the next one. Valete!